Let me tell you a story that starts in Waterbury, Connecticut, on July 13th, 1928. In those days, Waterbury was an industrious place, sometimes called the Brass City, a hub of manufacturing and hard-working families. It was here that Bob Crane entered the world, and though no one could have guessed it, his life would one day become the subject of headlines, television sets, newspapers, and countless conversations. Growing up, Bob wasn't thinking about Hollywood or national fame, at least not at first. He was just a kid who loved banging on the drums. According to various local newspaper clippings from the time, the people who knew him in Waterbury talked about a boy who couldn't pass up a good beat. He would tap rhythms on desk surfaces, kitchen tables, anything he could get his sticks on. His early fascination with percussion would foreshadow a love for performance that carried him through the rest of his life. By the time he hit middle school, Bob Crane had found some like-minded buddies who enjoyed the cadence of drums and bugles as much as he did. They put on local drum and bugle parades in the neighborhood. Those events, from what old locals in Connecticut recounted in archived interviews, were small but lively. People would gather on porches or stand in the street watching this ragtag group of young men, completely enthralled by their pep and enthusiasm. Bob's involvement with Norwalk Symphony Orchestras, often in a junior capacity, also suggests that even in his teenage years, he was either seeking mentorship or simply wanting more exposure to the rhythmic world that so captivated him. He would walk into the practice halls with a grin on his face, ready to play. Stories from that time mention the sense of excitement he brought whenever he arrived, drumsticks clutched in his hands, eager for the next piece. Stanford High School, where Bob ended up after finishing middle school, was known for its robust extracurricular offerings. According to some recollections preserved in local archives, he participated in marching band activities and cultivated friendships centered around music and radio dramas of the day. The entire nation was hooked on radio for entertainment then, and people listened to radio plays, comedic sketches, and big band music on large, elegant radio sets that were usually the centerpiece of the living room. Bob was part of the generation that discovered just how much an on-air personality could influence people's daily lives. By 1946, the year he graduated, he had already formed a strong personal identity around these cultural influences: drumming, radio, and comedic banter. That same year, 1946, Bob Crane joined the Connecticut Army National Guard. It was just after World War II had ended, and a lot of young American men were either returning from service or finding new opportunities in uniform. According to some historical documents, men in the National Guard in Connecticut spent time on training exercises that prepared them for any national emergencies. Bob was honorably discharged in 1950. That date, 1950, would go on to have additional significance for him because he married his high school sweetheart, Ann Terzian, that same year. She was someone he'd known from those Stanford High School days. Together, they had 3 children: Robert David, Deborah Ann, and Karen Leslie. People who knew the couple in those early years said that they seemed like a classic American family, complete with big dreams and unwavering optimism about the future. But 1950 wasn't just about marriage and leaving the National Guard. It was also the year Bob found his calling, the thing that would catapult him onto a different plane entirely: a career in radio as a DJ. When you consider the radio landscape of the early 1950s, it was still a golden age. Television existed but hadn't yet supplanted radio's central cultural role in households across America. Radio hosts, particularly morning show DJs, had significant power in shaping local community discourse. They'd share news, music, local events, and comedic bits. Bob's knack for talking, improvising, and riffing on any topic, be it sports, politics, or community happenings, proved invaluable. It's no surprise, then, that his earliest positions included stints at Hornell, New York's Walter L. Eberhard Sr. and Associates, a smaller station that gave him a taste of that microphone magic. Then he shifted to Bristol, Connecticut's WBIS and Bridgeport's News Radio 600 WICC, building a reputation for quick wit and a natural sense of showmanship. Yet the real turning point, one that would be recounted in entertainment magazines, oral histories, and blog posts for decades, came when Columbia Broadcasting System's KNX in Los Angeles offered Bob Crane the morning show spot. KNX, standing for Knowledgeable Network Exchange, was part of the CBS radio empire, making it a major broadcaster, particularly in Southern California. According to news articles of the period, KNX's morning show was a central fixture for Los Angeles commuters. The hustle and bustle of LA, with its burgeoning entertainment industry and sprawling suburban developments, was a different environment than the East Coast, but for Bob, that was an opportunity. He and Ann decided to visit Los Angeles to see if they could handle living in a place so far removed from their tri-state roots. After all, the entire family was from New York, Connecticut, and New Jersey. This was going to be a big shift. Once Bob got that morning gig, he was on the air 6 days a week, from 6 a.m. to 10 a.m. According to his son Robert, who's given multiple interviews over the years, this was a pivotal moment for their entire family. In one interview, Robert mentioned how it felt when his dad told everyone they were moving to Los Angeles because of KNX. It was exciting, nerve-wracking, and filled with promise. Bob, who never seemed to run out of energy, reveled in the hectic schedule. He'd wake up before dawn, rush to the station, and then command the airwaves for 4 solid hours of comedic bits, music, and engaging banter. What separated Bob from many of his contemporaries on the radio was his improvisational ability. Radio historians, along with people who archived recordings of his shows, have written about how Bob rarely worked from a script. He seemed to operate from a place of pure spontaneity. That approach was risky. Any radio consultant would caution you that one wrong word or a moment of dead air could lose listeners. But Bob handled it with confidence. He wove jokes, observational humor, references to local news, sports commentary, and occasionally even drum interludes into a seamless on-air presence. In the days of vinyl records, when a DJ had to juggle multiple turntables, Bob excelled. He had 4 turntables around him, each loaded with different music or sound effects. He'd slip on his headphones, and in one corner of the booth, he had a small drum set that he'd use to play along with certain tunes on air. Robert, looking back, was apparently mesmerized as a child, watching his father command this environment. Picture a microphone rigged almost like a horse collar around Bob's neck, enabling him to stand, sit, move around. Anything he needed to do to keep the energy up. He was known to never drink coffee, fueling himself only with the sheer exhilaration of entertaining others. He loved radio until the day he died, Robert said in one interview. That love was the spark that kept Bob's comedic engine revving, even after the microphone turned off each morning. While Bob's passion for radio was unwavering, he also idolized Hollywood performers like Gig Young and Jack Lemmon. Both actors were known for their ability to do comedic roles as well as serious dramatic parts. And there Bob was, in the heart of Los Angeles, able to see studios and talk to people in the entertainment industry. By the time the early 1960s rolled around, he thought to himself, I'm in Hollywood now. Theater, television, movies, why not give them a try? Some well-chronicled moments suggest that Bob's radio presence made an impression on influential industry figures. Rod Serling, the mastermind behind The Twilight Zone, once gave him a brief narration for the show when Bob had Serling as a guest on his radio program. Carl Rayner, the creator of The Dick Van Dyke Show, took note of Bob's comedic flair. As a result, Bob Crane landed a recurring role as the husband of one of the show's supporting characters. That was considered a big break given that The Dick Van Dyke Show was at the top of the television ratings at the time. Shortly after, Bob got more opportunities, including a recurring role on The Donna Reed Show as Dr. Dave Kelsey. Archival press kits and the official Donna Reed Show production notes confirm that he appeared in 62 episodes between 1963 and 1965, all while juggling that radio show schedule. In fact, Bob's family recalled how he'd have to pre-tape parts of the KNX morning show because he'd sometimes need to be on the television set at 8 a.m. Then came the moment that would define Bob Crane for millions of viewers around the country: Hogan's Heroes. At that time, Bob was known in Hollywood circles and among radio listeners, but he wasn't yet a household name. That changed when he was cast as Colonel Robert Hogan, the senior-ranking POW officer in a show that took the bold step of setting a sitcom in a German prisoner of war camp during World War II. It was the mid-1960s, specifically 1965, only 2 decades after the war had ended. Some network executives initially worried that a comedy in a POW camp might offend viewers, especially given the war's relatively recent end. But ironically, that edgy premise became part of the show's charm, along with top-notch comedic writing. During the earliest episodes of Hogan's Heroes, Bob Crane still attempted to keep his radio gig going. He'd arrive on the set of Hogan's Heroes, wearing his trademark grin, having already wrapped up hours of radio. But eventually, the workload was too big. After about 6 to 8 episodes into the first season, Bob realized he had to make a choice. The end of August that year marked his final broadcast at KNX. It was a risky step, but one that allowed him to devote his energies fully to the TV show. Hogan's Heroes turned out to be a hit, defying all skeptics. Bob starred alongside Werner Klemperer as Colonel Wilhelm Klink, John Banner as Sergeant Hans Schultz, Ivan Dixon as Sergeant James Kinchlow, Larry Hovis as Sergeant Andrew Carter, Robert Clary as Corporal Louis LeBeau, and Richard Dawson as Corporal Peter Newkirk. The group dynamic, as various cast interviews and behind-the-scenes documentaries attest, was comedic gold. Viewers loved seeing these Allied prisoners outsmart the camp's Nazis at every turn. Even though the premise could raise eyebrows, some critics expressed concern in periodicals, worried that the comedic portrayal might trivialize the war. The show managed to navigate its delicate subject matter by focusing on comedic mischief rather than the darker realities of POW life. CBS gave the show a prime spot, and it ran for 6 seasons, from 1965 until 1971. Magazines like TV Guide and industry publications often reported on the high ratings and the surprising longevity of the show. Bob's portrayal of Colonel Hogan became emblematic of clever, light-hearted leadership in dire circumstances. People would tune in week after week, enthralled by how the prisoners always stayed one step ahead of their captors. When Bob first heard about Hogan's Heroes, he actually hesitated, telling his agent that he wanted to do a straight comedy. His agent assured him that the new show was indeed comedic, and Bob ultimately agreed. That sense of initial doubt was overshadowed by excitement. His son Robert later remarked that a comedy set in a POW camp could only have gotten the green light in that particular era, 1965, when American television audiences were starting to see boundaries being pushed in new ways. People unfamiliar with the concept sometimes confuse the show with being set in a concentration camp, which was obviously inaccurate and would have been far more controversial. But once viewers actually watched Hogan's Heroes, it was apparent that this was no grim portrayal of a concentration camp. Instead, it was a comedic fantasy of cunning POWs outwitting inept Nazi officers. The show soared, pulling in strong viewership. CBS executives, sponsors, and even visiting writers would swing by the set, apparently enthralled by the cast's energy and comedic timing. Over the course of its run, Hogan's Heroes became the kind of staple that fans felt personally attached to. It ended in 1971 without a final, conclusive episode. Some viewers wrote letters to CBS, recorded in fan club newsletters, complaining that the show vanished too abruptly. But that's how the network system sometimes worked back then. If the ratings dipped or if the network decided on a change in direction, a show could vanish with little warning. With Hogan's Heroes over, Bob Crane likely assumed that a new range of opportunities would open up for him. He had proven himself to be a capable lead actor in a highly rated sitcom. He had comedic timing, an engaging presence, and an established fan base. He also wanted to appear on popular shows like Quincy, The Doris Day Show, Love, American Style, and Night Gallery. However, he didn't just want cameo appearances or guest roles. The man was hunting for another show that he could call his own, but opportunities were harder to come by than he anticipated. It took 4 years, but eventually he secured a lead role in a new series, albeit one that struggled from the start. Titled Second Start Is at First, the show was a single-camera comedy about a man in his 40s who decides he wants to start over and go to medical school. It sounded somewhat reminiscent of later shows like Carol's Second Act, but it never found its footing. Produced by Mary Tyler Moore's company, it had a strong pedigree on paper because Mary Tyler Moore's production banner was behind successful sitcoms like The Mary Tyler Moore Show, The Bob Newhart Show, Rhoda, and Phyllis. But crucially, it lacked the input of creative legends like Jim Brooks or Alan Burns, who'd been instrumental in those other hits. Viewers didn't connect with the premise or the execution. Bob liked that it became a 3-camera show filmed in front of a live studio audience because it gave him the immediate feedback of laughter, but the ratings told a grim story. Ultimately, it ran for just 13 episodes, overshadowed in its time slot by the immensely popular The Waltons. With that disappointment, Bob started looking elsewhere. He turned toward dinner theater. He got involved with small touring plays, including one called Beginner's Luck, which he actually rewrote to suit his own comedic sensibilities. The storyline was about a cheating husband, not exactly the most wholesome subject matter, but Bob saw comedic angles he could exploit. The upside of dinner theater is that it's intimate. You're right there with the audience, and if you have comedic chops, you can feed off their reactions. In multiple interviews that Robert Crane gave later, he explained how his dad would direct, perform, and do everything to shape the play into something that fit him perfectly. This was a 4-person play, making it easy to move from city to city, giving Bob a direct line to his fans. Though he had tried a few films around that time, none of them gained traction. Dinner theater became his safe haven, a place where he could still hear that laughter and sense that immediate gratification. In the late 1970s, Bob Crane was already feeling like the bigger shows in Hollywood weren't knocking on his door. He'd see other people landing parts he wasn't even considered for, and that stung. He had bills to pay, including alimony from his second wife, Patty, who he was in the process of divorcing. By 1978, he was out on the road with Beginner's Luck, performing in Scottsdale, Arizona. Scottsdale, at that time, was known for golf courses, desert landscapes, a budding tourist industry, and a quieter atmosphere than Los Angeles. Bob set up there for what was meant to be about a month-long run. The fateful part is that he befriended a man named John Carpenter, no relation to the famous film director. This John Carpenter was a video equipment salesman who'd known Bob for a while. The two had gone out at night. caroused, and shared an interest in videotaping personal encounters. Carpenter worked for companies like Sony, demonstrating some of the latest home video equipment, which was a big deal at the time. VCRs were just coming onto the consumer market in the 1970s, and not everyone even knew how to operate them. For Bob, who loved technology, recording, and presumably the novelty of capturing personal moments on tape, Carpenter was a buddy who helped him indulge those interests. But as time wore on, Bob started finding Carpenter to be more of an annoyance than a friend. According to what Bob told his son, Carpenter was no longer any fun. The friendship had run its course. In June of 1978, Bob Crane made the call that things had to change. He wanted to finalize his divorce from Patty, and he had his sights on a new house in Los Angeles. He was looking toward a fresh start, but he never got that chance. On a night around 3 a.m., Bob Crane was bludgeoned to death in his Scottsdale apartment. The details remain harrowing and have been recounted in countless newspaper articles, investigative pieces, and even a 2002 film about his life. His co-star in the play, Victoria Berry, discovered his body when he failed to show up for a scheduled appointment, and she grew concerned. Authorities later determined he had been struck twice in the head with a blunt object while he slept. The local police suspected that the murder weapon could have been a camera tripod, one of those pieces of equipment Bob had been so fond of using. Scottsdale, in 1978, had a small police force not used to handling high-profile murders, let alone ones involving semi-famous Hollywood actors. They only had about 2 murders a year back then. The immediate suspect was John Carpenter, given that he was close to Bob, had access to that kind of equipment, and was actually in town at the time. The police believed Carpenter had both the means and opportunity, but proving that in court turned out to be nearly impossible. The case languished for years, partly because forensic techniques weren't as advanced and the local police simply weren't prepared for the media frenzy that descended upon them. In the early 1990s, new DNA testing technologies briefly revived interest in the cold case. Ultimately, John Carpenter was brought to trial in 1994, some 16 years after Bob's death. The trial, which lasted about 6 weeks, garnered widespread attention from major newspapers, tabloids, TV news, and more. Bob's son, Robert, took the stand, but could only share that his father had called Carpenter a pain and wanted to cut him out of his life. There was no concrete, smoking gun piece of evidence that tied Carpenter directly to the murder scene, at least not enough to persuade the jury beyond a reasonable doubt. So Carpenter walked free. He died of a heart attack in 1998, taking whatever secrets he might have had to his grave. The investigation effectively hit a dead end. In subsequent years, the DNA evidence was exhausted in testing, and the suspected murder weapon, the missing tripod, never turned up. The final question people often pose is, what is Bob Crane's true legacy? For some, it's forever tied to Colonel Hogan, an irreplaceable comedic force in a show that dared to find humor in a POW camp. For others, it's the heartbreak of seeing an entertainer, once beloved, fade from the mainstream and end up a murder victim in a quiet Arizona suburb. And then there are fans of classic radio who argue that Bob's achievements behind the microphone might be as significant as anything he did on television. Whether you knew him from the radio days, discovered him through Hogan's Heroes reruns, or read about his murder case in a true crime anthology, there's no denying that Bob Crane left a mark on American entertainment. Plenty of folks still watch Hogan's Heroes on classic TV channels or streaming services. The show remains surprisingly timeless for something so grounded in a mid-century context. The comedic premise still resonates with viewers who appreciate old-school sitcom style. And each time Bob Crane's face lights up the screen, delivering lines that underscore Colonel Hogan's quick thinking and sly grin. You can see how he was born for that role. One blogger who specialized in vintage television once wrote, "No one else could have pulled off Hogan like Bob Crane. It's as though the entire show was just waiting for him to step into that uniform and play it exactly the way he did. Knowing what befell him in Scottsdale only makes it more poignant. Yes, it's a grim reality that overshadowed the final chapter of his life. But for all the tragedy, Bob Crane remains, to many who watch those reruns, a comedic hero who brought cunning and levity to a show that took a huge gamble on an unconventional premise. Radio historians might remember him for the daily on-air improvisations that made LA commuters chuckle during their morning drive. No matter how you remember him, drumming as a kid in Connecticut, acting alongside Hollywood legends, cracking jokes on the radio, or starring as Colonel Hogan, there's no doubt he left an impression. And while many of us might wish we could rewrite the tragic end to his story, all we can do is reflect on the countless moments of joy and laughter he brought to audiences everywhere. Some fans even say if only he'd stayed in radio, or if only Hogan's heroes had never ended. But those are the kinds of what-ifs that history never answers. So maybe in the end, Bob Crane was meant to be Colonel Hogan, the improvisational genius of the airwaves, and the comedic star who kept forging ahead even when the cards were stacked against him. Wherever you encounter him, in old photos, classic TV station reruns, or archived radio segments, remember that behind that grin was someone who genuinely loved making people laugh. Even if you rarely watch Hogan's Heroes now, when you do, it's almost impossible to imagine any actor other than Bob Crane portraying Colonel Hogan with such effortless charm. Rest in peace, Bob Crane. And to everyone listening, if you've got a moment, go watch an old episode of Hogan's Heroes, or tune into a classic radio segment if you can find one. Drop a comment or a message somewhere, letting people know what you think. Let's keep that legacy alive just a bit longer. Go seek out those clips, share them, and keep the laughter echoing. It's a small way to honor a man whose life may have been cut short, but whose spark of comedic brilliance should never be forgotten.